Chapter 1: The Boy at the Table. One rule. That was all Lucien Arcady gave himself whenever he stepped into a public space. Sit where you can see the door. Not paranoia. At least, that's what he told himself on the mornings, when sleep didn't come easy and the shadows behind his eyes felt too familiar to be just dreams. It was a habit, built over years spent in rooms where the wrong seat could mean the wrong ending. Where a man who wasn't paying attention to the room wasn't a man who was relaxed. He was a man who was about to be caught off guard. And in the world Lucien had lived in for the better part of 2 decades, being caught off guard was not a recoverable mistake. So, the corner table. East window. Sightline clear to both the entrance and the street outside. Every morning. Same table. Same coffee. Same window. The café by Lake Union opened at 7. Lucien arrived at 8:53. Not because he was a creature of compulsion, though people who worked for him would have disagreed on that point, but because 8:53 was the precise window between the morning rush draining out and the mid-morning laptop crowd filtering in. 14 minutes, give or take, where the room was quiet enough that you could hear yourself think without trying. He needed that, more than he admitted to anyone, and considerably more than he admitted to himself. There was a version of Lucien Arcady that the public understood. The thumbnail sketch. The one that appeared in the business profiles when journalists were assigned to write about him and came back with the same 3 words every time. Quiet, private, disciplined. The kind of man who had turned a mid-tier Pacific freight company into a multi-billion-dollar logistics network without attending a single gala, giving a single keynote, or maintaining any social media presence that could be verified as genuine. A man who had achieved enormous things and then stepped back from the spotlight with such totality that the spotlight eventually stopped bothering to look for him. What those profiles did not contain. Because they could not contain it, because the information required a clearance level that did not technically exist in any public agency, was the earlier chapter. The one before the legitimate empire. The one that explained why Lucien knew how to read a room the way he read a room. Why he never sat with his back to an entrance. Why he had 4 people in his contact list identified only by symbols and reachable at any hour of the day for tasks that no HR department would have approved. He had been something else once. Not a criminal in the way that word usually lands, loud, visible, theatrical. He had never needed to be any of those things. What he had been was structural, foundational, the kind of person who was useful to people who needed things moved without records, financed without trails, and managed without witnesses. A logistics mind applied to an infrastructure that the law had not yet caught up to and that law enforcement had not yet assembled the picture of fully enough to name properly. He had built it, piece by piece, over years, and then, with the same methodical patience, he had taken it apart. Because the people he had helped build it with had stopped being careful. And careful was not just a preference in that world. It was the only rule that actually kept anyone alive and free. Once the careful was gone, the countdown started. And Lucien had never in his life been willing to wait for someone else's mistakes to land on his body. So he had exited. Systematically, without drama. He had transitioned the legitimate arms into what became the public-facing Arcady Logistics. He had buried the rest in ways that did not leave him exposed. And he had walked away from a life that most people in it never walked away from at all. A black coffee sat on the table in front of him. Untouched, still steaming. He didn't drink it immediately. He never did. It was not really about the coffee. It had never really been about the coffee. He just watched. That was the truth of it. The thing he never told the few journalists who occasionally ran soft profiles about the famously private Lucien Arcady, the logistics billionaire who preferred small neighborhood cafes to the rooftop bars and private clubs where his kind was supposed to belong. The story they ran was harmless and easy. Eccentric, unpretentious, a rich man who liked simple things. The real version was less flattering. Lucien came here because it was the only square footage in the entire city of Seattle where nothing was required of him. No decisions waiting. No calls from men whose names never appeared in any public record. No contracts that carried weight measured in more than just money. No one looking at him with that particular expression. The one that said they needed something and had already started calculating how to ask for it. Just a window, a cup going cold. And 20 minutes of being, functionally, no one. He had built an empire. Everyone in certain circles knew the outline of it: Arcady Logistics, Pacific Freight Routing, a portfolio that touched every major shipping corridor on the West Coast. What those circles didn't know, or at least didn't know the full shape of, was the other thing. The earlier thing. The architecture of influence and pressure and illegitimate money that Lucien had spent the years before the empire quietly dismantling. Not out of morality. That would be a clean story. He had dismantled it because the people he had helped build it stopped being careful, and careless people in that business were not just a liability, they were a countdown. So he had exited it. Systematically. Cleanly enough that the law never found a clean angle. Completely enough that the men who had once treated him as infrastructure now treated him as a ghost. Present in their memory. Absent from their operations. Or so he had believed. He watched a woman near the counter argue softly with her phone. A teenager in oversized headphones typed something frantic on a laptop. An older man near the door had an actual newspaper, folded crisp at the crease the way people used to fold them when paper still felt like it meant something. Ordinary morning. Ordinary people. He exhaled. Then the door opened. At first, nothing about the boy registered as unusual. Small frame. Gray hoodie with a fraying hem at the cuffs. Jeans that had been washed so many times the color had given up. Not stylishly faded, but truly worn out, the fabric thin at both knees. No backpack. No bag of any kind. No phone visible. Hands free. What registered? Quietly, ahead of any conscious processing, the way genuine situational awareness always fires before the thinking brain catches up, was the way the child moved. He stepped through the door and immediately scanned left. Then right. Not the way a child scans for a parent or a familiar face. Not the distracted sweep of a kid looking for a seat. The way someone scans for exits. The barista called out a warm greeting from behind the counter. The boy didn't respond. Not rudeness exactly. More like the word didn't reach him the way normal sounds reach normal people in normal moments. His attention was somewhere else entirely. Already processing the room. Already calculating. He kept walking. Slow steps. Deliberate. Each one placed with a kind of care that belonged more to an adult navigating something dangerous than a child entering a café on a Tuesday morning. Lucien noticed the shoes. Worn down unevenly. Left heel. Right toe. The specific pattern of someone who carried tension in their gait. Who walked ready to turn or to run. Hi viewers. If you have ever been in a situation where you had to read a room the moment you walked into it, just to feel safe, drop a comment and tell me, what does that feel like? The boy's gaze moved across the café. Methodical. Past the woman with the phone. Past the teenager with the headphones. Past the old man and his newspaper. Past the barista. Past the cluster of 3 women sharing a table near the back. Until it reached the corner. Until it reached Lucien. And stopped. Something shifted. Lucien felt it before he understood it. A change in air pressure that had nothing to do with the room's physical temperature. The particular weight of being looked at by someone who was not just seeing you but placing you. Measuring you against something they had already been told. The boy stood still for 3 full seconds. Then he reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and produced a small spiral notebook. The cheap kind. The $2 kind from a corner store. The cover was bent at one corner and there was a pen clipped to the wire spine. He held both with both hands and walked directly to Lucien's table. No asking. No waiting. No sideways glance to see if it was allowed. He just walked over, opened the notebook to a clean page, uncapped the pen, and wrote something quickly. 4 or 5 seconds of writing. Then he turned the notebook around and slid it forward across the table. 5 words. Can I sit with you? Lucien looked at the sentence. Then he looked at the child's face. Up close, certain things became visible that distance had hidden. The boy was younger than he had appeared from across the room. 9, maybe 10. The kind of age where the face still carries something soft and unfinished, and the contrast between that softness and what lived in his eyes was the kind of thing that once seen could not be unseen. The eyes were too careful, too still. The eyes of a child who had learned, somewhere along the way, that showing what you felt was a risk. There were faint circles beneath them, the specific darkness that comes not from one bad night but from many, from weeks of interrupted sleep, from a body that had stopped expecting rest and started expecting interruption instead. His hands were thin, the knuckles slightly reddened from cold, the fingernails short and clean, which was the one incongruous detail, cleaner than everything else about him, which meant someone at some point had emphasized that, had taught him that specific habit with enough repetition that it stuck even after everything else in his care had deteriorated. Lucien noticed all of this in under 4 seconds. He had always been like that, noticing, filing, but what he noticed next was not visual, not physical, not something a camera in this cafe would ever capture in any recording. It was scent, and Alpha's senses operated on a different register than most people acknowledged publicly. Not supernatural, not cinematic, just more finely tuned in certain specific directions, the way a musician's ear catches halftones a casual listener would miss. Lucien's ability to read a room had always run deeper than observation, deeper than pattern recognition, and what reached him now, cutting beneath the cafe's familiar layering of dark roast and warm bread and someone's vanilla latte, was something that moved every quiet alarm inside him at once. Fear. Real embedded fear, not the sharp spike of a bad moment, the kind that had been living in someone's system for a long time. The kind a body absorbs into its chemistry when it has stopped expecting safety and started using threat detection as its baseline operating mode. The kind that stops feeling like an emotion and starts feeling like a weather condition, a permanent atmosphere that a person has simply learned to live inside. Lucien had smelled that particular variety of fear before. He had smelled it on men in their 40s who had made serious errors and understood the arithmetic of what came next. He had smelled it on people sitting across from him at tables in rooms that were not cafes. He had never, in any context he could recall, smelled it on a child. And beneath that fear, Omega, young, barely present, almost completely flat, which was wrong in a way that was not subtle at all once you knew what you were sensing. An Omega child at this age should have a scent that was emerging, developing, soft but present in the specific way youth presents itself. This child had almost nothing, which meant one of two things, either a rare physiological delay, possible but unusual, or chemical suppression. Medication, the kind that was not prescribed by any legitimate doctor and was not available through any legitimate pharmacy. The kind used specifically on Omega children to prevent scent detection, to make them harder to identify, easier to move. Lucien set the coffee cup down slowly. He looked at the notebook one more time. Then at the boy's face, which had gone very still in the particular way a child's face goes still when they are bracing for rejection, when they have already started calculating how they will absorb the no that is probably coming. He pulled out the chair across from him. The boy sat. He placed the notebook on the table between them with the pen resting across the open page. He looked at the table, not at Lucien, the posture of someone who had been told, verbally or otherwise, not to presume too much. The barista glanced over. Curiosity, nothing more. She went back to her work. Lucien tore a corner from the paper napkin at the table edge. He pushed it toward the boy along with his own pen. He always carried one, a habit older than most of his habits. The boy blinked, then wrote, "My name is Cale." Lucien nodded. He wrote on the napkin, "How old are you?" Cale read it. His jaw tightened once. Then he wrote, 10. Lucien wrote, "Are you hungry?" A pause that lasted long enough to say several things about what that question meant to someone who had been asked it by the wrong people before. Then Cale nodded. Lucien raised one hand. The barista came over. He ordered without looking at the menu, hot chocolate, scrambled eggs, toast, and said it in the same tone he used to order his own coffee. Unremarkable. Just a man and a child. Nothing to look at. The barista smiled at Cale. Cale did not smile back. He stared at the table. When she left, Lucien wrote, "You don't have to look at anyone you don't want to." Cale read it. Something in the careful architecture of his expression shifted barely, but perceptibly. Not relief yet, but the possibility of it. The hot chocolate arrived first. Kale wrapped both hands around the mug and held it for a long moment before lifting it, testing the warmth of it against his palms the way a person who has been cold for a while does when warmth arrives and they don't quite trust that it will stay. The eggs came. Kale ate carefully, with that trained control that told Lucien more than any statement could. This child had learned to eat slowly. Not because he wasn't hungry, because hunger was not the point. The point was not drawing attention, not seeming desperate, not giving anyone a reason to take the plate away. 3 years of conditioning in a single meal. Lucien said nothing. He drank his coffee. Let the boy eat. His phone buzzed once. He glanced at it without lifting it from the table. Not the message he was waiting for. He set it down. Outside, across the street, the black SUV had not moved. He had noticed it parking while Kale was eating. Dark, tinted glass, engine running, positioned at the angle that gave its occupants a clear view of the cafe's front window. He wrote on the napkin, "Did someone send you here?" Kale set his fork down, looked at the question, then looked at the window, at the street beyond it, and then back at the table. He wrote slowly, each word pressed in with more care than the ones before. He said you would know what to do. Lucien read it. He felt the click of something shifting into place. The particular cognitive sensation of scattered information suddenly arranging itself into a shape that demanded attention. He wrote, "Who said that?" Kale hesitated, then wrote, "He told me not to say the name out loud. He said it would put him in danger. He said find the alpha at the corner table. He said show him the notebook." Lucien looked at the notebook. Kale opened it. He turned past several pages of small cramped writing, things Lucien couldn't read from this angle, until he reached a page near the middle and turned it to face Lucien. The handwriting on this page was different, smaller, older, written by an adult in a hurry. Lucien read it once. The room didn't change. The barista was still behind her counter. The old man near the door had turned another page of his newspaper. The café was exactly what it had been 60 seconds ago. But Lucien had changed, because the contents of that single notebook page, 5 sentences, written by an adult in hiding who had trusted a 10-year-old to carry the message to the right person, contained details that should not have been possible for anyone outside a sealed criminal investigation to know. Barcode registry marks, left wrist, inside surface, covered by bracelets the facility issued and called gifts, injection schedules, a compound name that Lucien recognized because he had once moved the supply chain that carried it offshore before he had burned that chain to the ground. He thought it was gone. Kale was still watching his face. Lucien looked up. The boy had stopped eating. He was holding the notebook against his chest now, waiting, reading Lucien the same way Lucien had been reading the room all morning. Lucien wrote one word, safe. Kale read it. He didn't relax. Children who had been in systems like the one Lucien was beginning to understand this boy had come from did not relax easily. Maybe not for a long time, maybe not for years, but he exhaled, just once. And that single breath carried something in it that pressed against something in Lucien's chest that he had kept behind a very sturdy wall for a very long time. His phone buzzed again. Chapter 2: What the Notebook Knew. The delivery alley behind the cafe smelled like wet concrete and the morning's first garbage collection. Kale stepped out behind Lucien and stopped. He stood very still in the narrow space between the brick wall and a stack of flattened cardboard boxes, and he looked at the gray sedan parked 20 feet away with the focused, calculating expression of a child who had learned not to get into cars without understanding what came next. He looked at Lucien. Lucien held up one hand. He pointed at himself, then at the car, then at Kale. Then he waited. He did not move toward the car, did not gesture for Kale to hurry, did not look over his shoulder at the alley entrance the way a man in a rush would. He just waited. Kale studied him for 4 full seconds. Then he walked to the car. The driver was a woman named Renata Voss, 41 years old. 14 years working for Lucien in varying capacities, all of them requiring absolute discretion and none of them carrying a job title she could have explained at a dinner party. She did not ask questions about the child in the back seat. She did not acknowledge him with more than a single glance in the rearview mirror. She simply pulled out of the alley and into the street at the exact speed that drew no attention from anyone. Lucien's phone buzzed. A confirmation from the security contact he had messaged from inside the café. Black SUV. Bright Bridge Youth Services. Private foster contractor operating in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and California. 3 active federal contracts. 2 social services certifications. Board of directors that included 2 former state legislators and a pediatrician with a national profile. And then the second part of the message. Majority financial ownership traced through 2 shell layers to Callaway Renner Capital Holdings. Lucien stared at those 4 words for a moment that lasted longer than it appeared to from the outside. Callaway Renner. He knew that name. He knew it the way you know certain things that are part of your history rather than your present. The way a man knows the name of the person who taught him how to do something he later became ashamed of knowing. Callaway Renner Capital Holdings had been the clean face. The legitimate-looking structure through which a significant portion of the money from the old network had been processed, reinvested, and laundered into the kinds of assets that banks financed and governments funded and newspapers called success stories. Shell companies inside shell companies. The kind of architecture that took years of forensic accounting to unravel, and longer than that to prove. Lucien had believed, with the kind of certainty that comes from watching something burn, that the architecture was gone. He had been wrong. The car moved through morning traffic. Cale sat beside him with the notebook pressed against his chest and his eyes forward and his body in that particular state of exhausted stillness that comes after sustained fear finally finds a pause. Lucien wrote on the back cover of the notebook, "How long were you at the facility?" Cale looked at the question for a moment, then wrote, "Since I was 7. 3 years." He looked out the window at the passing city. People walking to work. Coffee cups in hand. A woman pushing a stroller. A man on a bicycle running a yellow light. All of it completely ordinary in the way that the world is always completely ordinary around the things it cannot see. He looked back at Cale. He wrote, "Do you know the names of other children who were there?" Cale nodded. Wrote, "Some." He started writing on the next page. Names. Small names. First names only, most of them. A few with last names or partial last names. Ages he knew or guessed. Some descriptions. He wrote in careful lines, evenly spaced, with the specific attention of a child who understood that this list mattered. Lucien read each one. 12 names. 12 children. That Cale personally knew by name. Personally remembered. Who were, as of 2 nights ago when Cale had escaped, still inside the facility. He wrote, "Where is the facility?" Cale described it. Not an address, he didn't know the address, but a description. 2-story beige building on a property with a fence. There was a pond visible from the back windows. The road coming in had gravel for the last half-mile. There was a water tower visible in the distance on the east side with a name he had seen once but didn't remember fully. It started with W or maybe M. Not enough for a location, but something. Renata navigated off the main road and onto a side street, then into the narrow parking structure below the building Lucien owned that nobody associated with his name. The deed ran through a property management company. The property management company ran through a holding entity registered in a state with favorable privacy laws. He had used it as a safe house before, years ago, when safe houses were a professional requirement rather than an emergency measure. Today it was both. He got out of the car. Cale got out on his side without being told. Renata drove away without a word. The building had a small apartment above a bookshop on the ground floor. The bookshop was owned by a man named Darius Okafor who had known Lucien for 22 years, owed him a debt of the kind that could not be repaid in money, and who did not ask questions about visitors to the apartment above his store. They took the back stairs. The apartment was modest. A couch. A small kitchen. 2 windows overlooking a narrow street. The shelves were full of books. Darius had a habit of rotating his overflow stock upstairs, and the light through the windows was the particular pale gold of a Seattle morning that had decided, reluctantly, to be decent. Lucien turned on the stove. He found soup in the cabinet. The canned kind. He opened it and put it in a pot without asking whether Kale wanted it because the question was unnecessary. He found a clean blanket on the shelf in the hall closet and laid it over the arm of the couch without comment. Kale stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. Then he sat on the couch. Slowly. The way someone sits when they're testing whether the surface is as solid as it looks. It was. He pulled the blanket over his legs. Lucien stirred the soup and said nothing. He was not a man who had spent much time in domestic spaces. The apartment above Darius's bookshop was simple but functional. Darius was the kind of person who made any space feel considered, and standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand, Lucien was aware of the strangeness of it. The extraordinary ordinariness of the moment. Soup on the stove. A child on the couch. Rain beginning softly against the window glass. He had made difficult decisions in this apartment before. Years ago. Ones that changed the direction of multiple lives, only one of which was his. He did not think about that often. He was usually successful at not thinking about it. After a few minutes, when the soup was warm and the bowls were on the small kitchen table, he gestured toward the table. Kale came and sat. He ate. This time, incrementally, something changed. The control that had been so visible in the café, that careful, trained precision, began to ease at the edges. Not entirely. Not dramatically. But the tight architecture of how he held himself while he ate softened slightly. He ate a second bowl without waiting to be offered. He held the spoon a little less formally on the third bite. His shoulders, which had been kept noticeably level since the café, dropped by half an inch. These were small things, almost invisible things, but Lucien was a person for whom small things were the vocabulary of real information. Kale was, slowly and incrementally, beginning to decide that this was not a trap. That realization landed differently than Lucien expected. Lucien drank coffee he had made from a bag he found in the cabinet and watched the rain against the window and thought about systems, about timelines, about the specific distance between what he had believed was finished and what Kale's presence in this room now confirmed was very much not. His team had been working since he activated Protocol 7. Quietly, across multiple vectors, running the plate, pulling public filings on Brightbridge Youth Services, cross-referencing the names of board members against known investigative flags, mapping what could be mapped through publicly accessible financial records. He was waiting for the second wave of results. What he had already was enough to confirm several things he did not want confirmed. He pulled out the notebook. He opened it to the page Kale had written on. The one with the names, the descriptions, and also to the page in the middle with the adults writing. The message written in a hurry by someone who had trusted a 10-year-old child to carry it across a city and deliver it to the right person. He read it again. 5 sentences. The first described what Kale was, who he was, the fact that he had been inside the Brightbridge system for 3 years under a falsified intake record with no biological family contact on file. The second described the suppressant compound, the specific name, the dosage schedule, the delivery method, information that was not guessed, information that came from someone with direct access to facility records. The third described something Lucien had not encountered in any of the intelligence he had gathered during the years he was dismantling the network's infrastructure. A centralized registry, a database, not of children in foster care in the conventional sense. A separate record system, running parallel to the official one, accessible through a portal that required a specific credential, containing intake information, biological designations, suppression status, and something referred to in the document as transfer readiness. The fourth sentence named a company. Not Brightbridge, a different name, one layer further back. Lucien read that name and set the notebook down on the table. He looked at Kale, who had finished the soup and was now sitting with his knees pulled up and the blanket around his shoulders, watching Lucien with those 2 careful eyes that didn't flinch away the way most children's eyes did when they met someone they were uncertain of. He wrote on a fresh page, "The man who helped you, was he a worker at the facility?" Kale thought for a moment, then wrote, "Not exactly. He came sometimes. I don't know what his job was. He always seemed like he was checking something. He talked to the staff, but the staff acted different around him. Like they were being watched. Lucian nodded. An auditor. An inspector. Or, more likely, someone positioned as one. An inside contact who had spent time building access before using it. He wrote. Did he tell you his name? Cale shook his head. He wrote. Did he say anything else? Anything besides finding me? Cale thought longer this time. His forehead creased slightly with the effort of retrieving something precisely. Then he wrote, he said you burned the old network. He said you would understand what it meant if I was still walking around outside. Lucian read that sentence twice. He understood it. Because it wasn't a testimony. It wasn't a report. It was a message from someone who knew enough about Lucian's history to use his own logic against him as a motive. The Cale was still free. Still walking, still unsuppressed enough to reach someone. It meant someone inside the network had taken a significant personal risk to make that happen. Which meant the situation was serious enough that an inside contact had decided the risk was worth it. Which meant the timeline was short. The knock on the apartment door was soft. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. Renata's code. Lucian opened it. She handed him a single page. Printed. She left without entering. He read it standing in the doorway. His team had completed the first round of Brightbridge financial mapping. The findings were methodical and terrible. The company operated 17 facilities across 6 states. Intake records showed a pattern. Children with no living family contacts, or children from families in crisis who had signed paperwork without full understanding of its terms. The pattern of transfers was not random. Children designated as Omega, flagged in the parallel registry, were moved within a specific window, 48 to 72 hours after a secondary assessment. The assessment was listed in official records as a health evaluation. What it actually evaluated was something else. Transfer destination, listed in official records as placement with approved private families. What the financial records showed in the parallel account structures was payments, substantial ones, from entities whose names did not appear in any foster care licensing database. Cale put down his notebook. He had been watching Lucian read. He wrote a single line. They were going to move me in 2 days. Lucian looked at him. He already knew that. The document confirmed it. Someone had already processed a payment for Cale, not as a child in foster care. As a commodity in a transaction that had been planned weeks in advance, approved at a level well above any facility manager, and rubber-stamped by a financial structure that ran directly back to the remnants of the network Lucian had believed he had destroyed. He folded the page. He stood there for a moment in the doorway between the small kitchen and the main room. 12 names in a child's handwriting. Not files. Not case numbers. Not entries in a database that someone somewhere would eventually audit and find disturbing irregularities in. Names. Written from memory by a 10-year-old boy who had memorized them the way children memorize things they know they might need to hold on to, carefully, accurately, because no one else was going to do it for them. 12 children still inside the system. Tonight. Right now. While the morning rain ran down the bookshop's window and Darius probably sat downstairs reorganizing a shelf he had already reorganized 3 times this week because it was a Tuesday and that was what he did on Tuesdays. Lucian looked at the window. He thought about scale. He was a man who thought in scale professionally. In volume. In reach. In what it took to move something significant across a large geography without leaving the kind of traces that attracted the wrong kind of attention. He had applied that thinking to building things that made money. He had applied it once to taking apart things that shouldn't have existed. He was going to have to apply it again. He walked back to the main room. He looked at Cale, who was sitting on the couch in a borrowed blanket in a borrowed apartment above a bookshop that smelled faintly of old paper and the specific kind of quiet that buildings accumulate when good things have happened in them over a long time. Cale had the notebook open in his lap. He was not writing in it. He was reading something in it. Something near the beginning. His expression was hard to name. Not sad exactly, not frightened exactly. Something in between those two things that might have been called remembering. He looked up when Lucian came in. And then Cale wrote one more thing. He wrote it carefully. like it had been sitting in his chest since before he walked through the cafe door that morning, and he had been waiting for the right moment to let it out. He turned the notebook around. They said you were the only alpha they were afraid of. Lucien read it. Something moved behind his eyes that he did not show on his face. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Something closer to the weight of understanding what a sentence like that actually cost. What it meant that a child had been handed it like a key and told to carry it across the city to a stranger. It meant the people inside that system, the ones who had rebuilt what he destroyed quietly and patiently and right under every surface he had watched. They knew his name was still a variable they had not eliminated. And it also meant something else. Something that arrived cold and clear and without sentiment. If they knew Kale was coming here, they knew where here was. His phone buzzed. 3 messages in rapid succession from the investigative lead on his team. The first: Brightbridge is not a standalone operation. The second: financial mapping shows 17 facilities are entry nodes. The back end is a single collection point. Different company name, different state registration. Requires deeper access to confirm full scope. The third message had no text, just a number. Lucien looked at it, then looked at Kale. The number was a total count, not of facilities, not of financial transactions, of children, processed through the parallel registry system in the last 3 years alone, since the network had quietly, patiently, invisibly started rebuilding. Kale had fallen asleep. Sometime in the last few minutes, without Lucien noticing the transition, the boy had slumped sideways against the arm of the couch. The notebook was still in his hands. His breathing was slow, and even for the first time since Lucien had seen him walk through the cafe door. Lucien covered him with the blanket. He stood by the window and looked at the street below. Quiet. Ordinary. A man walking a dog. A delivery truck double-parked outside the bookshop. He thought about the number on his phone. He thought about what it meant to dismantle something once and believe the job was done. He thought about the 12 names in Kale's handwriting. He thought about a network that had rebuilt itself inside the legal structures he had helped make legitimate. Using the infrastructure of legitimacy as cover. Using the very clean exterior he had worked to construct as camouflage for what was happening underneath. It was more sophisticated than what it had been. Which meant it had learned from being dismantled once. Which meant whoever had rebuilt it understood him. The window glass was cold against the edge of his hand. Outside, on the street below, a black sedan had parked. Different plate than the SUV from this morning. Same angle. Same positioning. Same patient stillness of a vehicle whose occupants had arrived somewhere and intended to stay. Lucien stepped back from the window. He looked at the sleeping child on the couch. The notebook had slipped slightly from Kale's hands. One page was visible. The page with the adult's handwriting. The message written in a hurry, by someone inside a system run by people who feared the right name enough to send a mute 10-year-old across a city as a messenger. Lucien reached for his phone. He had a decision to make. Not about Kale, that decision had been made the moment he gestured to the chair. About what came next. About the kind of move you make when you understand that the problem is not just the facility, not just the company, not just the financial architecture. When you understand that the people who rebuilt this have spent 3 years growing it into something that now reaches into policy, into procurement, into the kind of power that does not arrest easily and does not frighten quickly and does not stop because one man decides it should. Lucien had dismantled one network. This was not a network. This was a system, and somewhere in the city tonight, 12 children whose names he had memorized were inside it. He opened a new message on his phone. He did not type the recipient's name, just a symbol. A single character that meant something specific to exactly 4 people in Lucien's contact list, all of them in different time zones, all of them with different skills, all of them owed nothing and expecting nothing except the kind of work that required the kind of person who did not need to be told twice. These were not people he had met at business dinners. They were people he had met in rooms where the stakes were such that their presence there was itself an answer to a question about who they were. A woman in Zurich who had spent 8 years embedded in financial investigation and left because the law moved too slowly. A man in Atlanta who had once built the exact kind of parallel account structure Lucien had been reading about in the Brightbridge documents, and who now spent his time tearing those structures apart for reasons he had never explained and Lucien had never asked about. A legal contact in Washington who knew which sealed documents could be unsealed with the right application and who understood the geography of federal oversight better than most people who worked inside it. And a fourth person, whose name Lucien had not said aloud in 6 years. He typed 3 words. "We have a problem." He sent it. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and stood still for a moment in the quiet apartment. Outside, the rain had steadied to something consistent. Not heavy, just present. The particular kind of Seattle rain that did not make demands, just arrived and stayed and made the city look like itself. Then he looked once more at Cale, who was sleeping on the couch in a borrowed apartment above a bookshop on a Tuesday morning, unknowingly at the center of something that was about to become much larger than either of them. And outside, 1 floor below, Lucien heard the bookshop door open, and close, and the footsteps that followed were not Darius. Comment below. Do you think Lucien can stop something this big alone? And what do you think happens when those footsteps reach the top of the stairs? Chapter 3 drops next. And what Lucien finds inside the registry records will change everything he thought he understood about who rebuilt this network and why. Chapter 3, You Smell Safe. The footsteps stopped. 1 floor below, just inside the bookshop entrance. Lucien did not move toward the window. He did not reach for his phone. He stood very still in the center of the apartment and listened with the whole of his attention the way a man listens when the difference between one outcome and another lives inside the next 15 seconds. Then he heard Darius. Low voice, unhurried. The particular cadence of a man greeting someone he was not surprised to see, but not happy about either. Then a second voice. Female. Short exchange. Something said about a package. Then the soft bell of the bookshop door closing again. A delivery. Lucien exhaled once through his nose. He crossed to the window and looked down at the street at an angle that kept him out of the sight line from below. The black sedan was still parked across the street. Had not moved. Had not changed position. Patient. That was the word for it. Whoever was in that car had been told to wait, and they were doing it without the kind of restlessness that surveillance amateurs always showed. No engine idle changes, no door cracking, no obvious phone light through the tinted glass. Just stillness. The specific, practiced stillness of people who did this for a living. Professional stillness. The kind that said this was not anyone's first time watching a location. Lucien turned away from the window. Cale was still asleep on the couch, the blanket pulled up to his chin, the notebook held loosely in both hands against his chest like something he had been told to keep safe and had taken seriously enough to keep hold of even in sleep. Lucien sat in the chair across from him and looked at the boy for a long moment. He was trying to do something he did not often do. He was trying to see Cale as a child. Not as evidence. Not as a source of critical information. Not as the center of a problem requiring a solution. Not as confirmation of a failure Lucien had spent years believing he had corrected. Just a 10-year-old boy who had crossed the city alone, in the wrong shoes, carrying a $2 notebook, and walked straight to a table in a café because someone had told him that the man sitting there was the only person in the city worth trusting. That was enormous courage. It deserved to be recognized as what it was. Lucien was not a man who used that word easily. He had been in rooms with people who wore it like a costume and had nothing underneath it. Real courage, in his experience, was quiet. It moved slowly. It looked like a child holding a pen with shaking hands because the message still needed to be delivered regardless of what delivering it cost. His phone buzzed. He read without making a sound. His contact in Washington had pulled 2 documents from sealed federal databases using a legal mechanism that existed in a gray zone that Lucien's attorney had spent 4 months mapping 3 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. The first was a copy of Cale's official intake record with Brightbridge Youth Services. The second was his record in the parallel registry. The 2 documents were not the same person. The official intake record showed a child named Marcus Ellison, age 9, admitted to the Brightbridge Lake County facility after abandonment by a single guardian. No medical flags. No designation notes. Routine. The parallel registry record showed a child with a barcode ID, age 10, Omega designated, suppression protocol active, transfer status, pending, buyer confirmation received, payment cleared, transfer window, 48 hours from the date 2 days ago. The name in the parallel record was not Marcus Ellison. The name in the parallel record was Cale. Just the one name, no last name, no family history, as if whoever had built the registry understood that full names created paper trails and single names created nothing. That was what this child was to that system. A number with a name attached. Lucien set the phone face down on his knee. He looked at Cale sleeping. The boy's face in sleep was different from his face awake. Awake, every feature was managed, controlled, eyes running constant assessment of every room he entered. Even at the café table, even eating soup in this apartment, some part of Cale had been on watch. Asleep, all of that was gone. What remained was just a child's face. Young, thin. A small scar near the left eyebrow that Lucien had not noticed before. Barely visible, old enough to have faded to near nothing. The kind of scar that came from a corner of something. A shelf. A door frame. The kind of ordinary injury that happens to children in spaces that are too crowded and not well supervised. Or in spaces where supervision means something other than care. His phone buzzed again. His team had located the facility. Not through an address. Cale had been right that he didn't know it. Through the water tower. The one he had described from the east-facing windows. His description, faded lettering W or M, visible at a distance, had been specific enough. There were 14 water towers visible from properties within a 40-mile radius that matched the other environmental details Cale had given. His team had cross-referenced Brightbridge property holdings in the state. 3 matches. Then cross-referenced road surfaces against county maintenance records. 1 match. A property in a rural stretch of King County registered to a property management LLC 8 years ago. The LLC's incorporation paperwork listed a registered agent whose name appeared twice in Lucien's own records from the years of the dismantling. Someone who had been part of the original network's administrative layer. Quietly repositioned. Still active. Still here. Lucien read the address. Memorized it. Deleted the message. He thought about the 12 names. He thought about the 48-hour window, now reduced to 36. Cale made a sound in his sleep. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind a child makes when a dream turns in a direction it was not supposed to go. The blanket shifted. His grip on the notebook tightened. Lucien watched without moving. After a few seconds the sound stopped. The grip on the notebook loosened. The breathing steadied back to the slow rhythm of genuine rest. Lucien stood quietly and went to the kitchen. He put the kettle on. He found tea in the cabinet. Darius kept tea the way some people kept books, organized in categories that made sense only to himself, and made a cup without noise and stood at the kitchen window looking at the alley below. He was running calculations. Not financial ones. Those were easy. He could move money in ways that left no traceable mark at a scale large enough to matter, faster than most people understood was possible. That part of this was not the problem. The problem was time and exposure. To dismantle the full system, not just Brightbridge, not just the facility, not just the 12 children inside it tonight, but the complete architecture, the financial layer, the political protection, the senator whose advocacy for privatized foster care had created the regulatory gaps that this entire operation ran through. The buyers whose names were in those payment records. The network that had quietly rebuilt itself inside the infrastructure of legitimacy. All of it. That could not be done quietly in 36 hours. Some of it could. The facility. The children. Tonight. That part had a different kind of solution. Shorter timeline. More direct. The kind of problem that required physical movement rather than legal positioning. He heard Cale wake up. Not from a sound. From the specific change in the quality of the silence in the next room, the slight shift of weight on the couch cushion, the small intake of breath that preceded full consciousness. Lucien carried the tea to the doorway. Cale was sitting up on the couch, the blanket around his shoulders, the notebook open in his lap. His eyes were doing what they always did first, scanning. Left, right, ceiling, window, door. They landed on Lucien. Held there. Lucien raised the mug slightly. Cale looked at it for a moment, then nodded. Lucien set it on the small side table. He sat back down in the chair across from him. Cale looked at the tea. Then at the window where the Seattle rain was doing what it did in the early afternoon, persisting without drama. Present and gray and consistent. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "How long did I sleep?" Lucien looked at his watch. Wrote back, "About 2 hours." Cale nodded. He looked at his hands. Then he wrote something, paused, read what he had written, and crossed it out. He tried again. Crossed that out too. On the third attempt, he left it. He turned the notebook around. "I had a nightmare. About the van." Lucien read it. He did not respond immediately. He thought about what kind of response was useful and what kind was just noise filling a space that didn't need filling. He wrote, "You're not in the van." He looked at the sentence. It was plain, almost too plain. But Cale read it, and something in his face shifted exactly the way it had shifted in the café when Lucien wrote the word safe. Not all the way, not completely, but a fraction more. He wrote back, "I know." Then, after a pause, he wrote something else. Lucien read it twice. "You smell safe, like the air outside after rain." I didn't know alphas could smell like that. The sentence landed somewhere behind Lucien's sternum and stayed there. He was a man who had been called many things in his life. Powerful, controlled, dangerous by people who had reason to use the word and people who were borrowing it to feel important. He had been respected in rooms that required a particular kind of person to occupy them, and feared in rooms that required a different kind entirely. He had never been told that he smelled safe. He had never been told he smelled like the air after rain. He had spent the last several years building things. Legitimate things. Things that worked inside systems with oversight and regulation and the basic assumption that the people involved were operating in good faith. He had told himself that was enough. That the exit from the earlier world was the entire transaction. Leave. Build something clean. That was the ending. But a 10-year-old boy sleeping on a couch with a notebook pressed to his chest had just said 3 words that quietly dismantled that entire story. "You smell safe." Which meant that this specific moment, this person in this chair, this apartment on this rainy afternoon, was possibly the first experience of its kind that Cale had ever had with an alpha. The first time it had felt like safety instead of something else. That was not something Lucien had a response to that fit in the space of a notebook exchange. So he wrote the only thing that seemed accurate. "You're safe here." Cale read it, nodded once. Then he reached for the tea. The afternoon moved. Darius came up once, briefly, with a second blanket and 2 sandwiches and left without unnecessary conversation. Lucien ate standing at the window. Cale ate on the couch watching the rain. Then Lucien's team sent through a preliminary document on the senator. Senator Aldridge Beaumont, 17 years in office. Vocal champion of the Safe Homes Private Initiative, a piece of policy that had reshaped foster care contracting in 4 states over the last decade. His name appeared in Brightbridge's official filings 4 times, as a policy reference, a public advocate, a quoted supporter. Not as a shareholder. Nothing that would hold in a standard disclosure review. But in the parallel financial records, in the accounts connecting back to Callaway Renner, a series of transactions structured as consulting fees paid to a firm registered to Beaumont's brother-in-law. Over 3 years. Substantial amounts. Buried carefully. But there. Lucien photographed the documents and filed them in an encrypted folder backed up to a server that no subpoena had ever successfully reached. He thought about the journalist. Her name was Zora Callahan Price. 34 years old. She had broken 2 federal contracting scandals in 5 years, both of them the kind of institutional misconduct that law enforcement had known about and chosen not to prioritize because the people involved had the right connections in the right places. She did not respond to cold approaches. She did not trust anonymous tips unless they came with the kind of documentation that could not be dismissed. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person this situation required. But she knew someone who knew Lucien. That connection had never been used. He had kept it in reserve the way you keep certain things. Not because you plan to use them, but because you understand that there are moments where only one specific thing will work, and when that moment arrives, you want to have it ready. Tonight, it would be used, because the facility required one kind of response. Direct, physical. The 12 children inside it required someone to move quietly through the right channels tonight, before the transfer window closed, in a way that the sealed grand jury proceeding could absorb without premature exposure. His team could manage that. But the senator, the political architecture that had created the regulatory gaps, the quiet approvals, the unchecked contracting that made the whole network structurally possible, required something different. Something public. Something that no amount of legal maneuvering or political connection would be able to contain once it was seen by enough people. Zora Callahan Price knew how to do that. She had done it twice already. And both times the people who thought they were protected had found out, in the hardest possible way, that visibility is its own kind of justice. Lucien picked up his phone. He composed a message to the person who sat between him and Zora in the chain of trust. Careful wording. No names. No specifics. Just enough to signal that the reserved connection was being activated, and that the documentation would be following through a secure channel within the hour. He sent it. Then he set the phone down and looked at the window for a moment. The rain had not changed. Steady. Patient. The kind of weather that did not rush. He needed about 20 more minutes of quiet thinking before he made the second call. The one to the contact in Washington who would begin positioning the children's emergency placements. The one that had to happen before anyone else moved, because the children were the priority and always had been. Cale had stopped eating. He was drawing in the back of the notebook. Small, careful drawings. Lucien could not see what from this angle, but the movement of the pen was different from writing. Slower, more deliberate, with occasional pauses where Cale tilted his head and looked at what he had made before continuing. Lucien watched him for a moment. Then he wrote, "What are you drawing?" Cale looked up, then turned the notebook around. The café, the corner table, the window, the street outside. He had drawn the view from the chair he had sat in, the angle facing Lucien, and he had gotten the proportions right. The curve of the window frame, the table edge, the coffee cup. And across the table, rendered in careful lines, a man. Not a detailed portrait, but accurate in the ways that mattered. The posture, the stillness of him, the way he sat like someone paying full attention without appearing to. Under the drawing, Cale had written 2 words. The start. Lucien looked at those 2 words for a long time. The start. He thought about all the things that phrase contained. The café on a Tuesday morning. A gray hoodie with a fraying hem. A notebook pushed across a table by thin, careful hands. 5 words written in a child's handwriting that did not know how much weight they were carrying. Most things that ended up matching started small. Lucien had learned that years ago and had spent a significant portion of his adult life finding ways to not think too hard about it. He set the notebook down and looked at the window. The rain outside was different now. Less insistent. The kind that had made its point and was settling in for the long version of the story. He thought about Darius downstairs, alphabetizing something with the focused attention of a man who understood that order was not just a preference but a practice. A daily choice. A way of asserting that the world could be arranged into something that made sense, even when the world did not cooperate. He thought about the 12 names. He thought about how long a child remembered a face that had been safe. How long before the memory faded or calcified into something that couldn't be reached. He had maybe 1 more hour before the calls had to start. His phone buzzed. The message from his federal contact changed everything he had been planning. The investigation into Brightbridge, the one he had believed was still in early stages, had been building for 22 months. There was a sealed grand jury proceeding already in progress. And the lead investigator's name in the sealed filing was someone Lucien recognized immediately. Demarion Osei, a name he had not heard in 6 years. The same federal investigator who had once been the most effective agent assigned to the original network Lucien had dismantled. The same man who had been quietly pulled from that case before it reached prosecution, for reasons that were never publicly explained and that Lucien had always believed were not coincidental. The same man who was now, apparently, the lead on a 22-month embedded investigation that was already surrounding Brightbridge from the inside. Lucien set the phone down. He looked at Cale's drawing again. The start. He thought about the person who had helped Cale escape. The inside contact. The adult whose handwriting filled that one page in the middle of the notebook. Who had known Lucien's name, his habits, which specific table he sat at, and that Cale was the right person to carry the message. An investigator embedded inside Brightbridge for 22 months would know all of those things. That investigator would have access to the parallel registry. He would know that the transfer scheduled for Cale was closing in. And he would know that moving Cale through official channels before the grand jury sealed the case would trigger premature exposure that could collapse everything. So instead, he had sent a child across a city with a notebook. To a man who had already proven he could dismantle this kind of structure once, and was being trusted to do it again without touching the investigation, without triggering the exposure too early, without leaving a visible trace. The way Lucien had always done it. He stood. He walked to the kitchen. He stood at the counter with both hands flat on the surface and breathed through the full weight of what had just become clear. The scale of what Demarian had been building. The trust it required to place a child at the center of it. And the thing still pressing. Still requiring a decision in the next few hours. 12 children. 31 miles northeast. 36 hours. His phone buzzed one final time that afternoon. For words from the contact in Washington. Grand jury seals Friday. 3 days. Which meant everything Lucien was going to do about the facility had to happen without triggering the larger proceeding prematurely. Quiet. No spectacle. No visible connection to the sealed case. He walked back to the doorway. Cale had closed the notebook. He was looking at the window. The rain had eased slightly. The afternoon light, what passed for afternoon light in Seattle in this season, had shifted to that pale gold that appeared in the hour before evening when the clouds thinned just enough to let something through without committing to it. Cale looked at Lucien. He did not write anything. He just looked. And in that look was something that did not require translation. This child already knew tonight was not going to be quiet. He had known it since before he walked into the café. He had carried the knowledge across the city in a $2 notebook and delivered it to the one person he had been told was capable of doing something about it. And now he was sitting in a borrowed apartment in a borrowed blanket waiting to find out if that trust had been correctly placed. Lucien held the boy's gaze for a moment. Then he turned and picked up his phone and made the first of 4 calls. The first call lasted 9 minutes. It went to the contact in Washington. Specific instructions. Specific timing. The language of it was not dramatic. It sounded, to anyone who might have been listening, like a logistics conversation. Which was exactly what it was. Just not the kind that moved freight. The second call lasted 4 minutes. It went to a woman named Tavita Reeves who ran a licensed emergency placement network in the Pacific Northwest and who had worked quietly alongside several federal child welfare investigations over the years without ever appearing in any public document. He told her what he needed. She told him she could have it operational by 11. The third call lasted 2 minutes. It went to an attorney named Cornelius Bates who had spent 30 years in family court and who understood the specific legal mechanisms required to receive children from a facility under investigation without triggering the kind of paperwork that took weeks to move. The fourth call lasted 7 minutes. It went to the person who sat between Lucien and Zora Callahan Price. When it was over, Lucien set the phone down on the kitchen counter. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked back to the living room doorway. Outside, steady and gray and patient, Seattle rain kept falling, while 12 children slept in a facility 31 miles northeast of the city. And the clock hit its final turn. The thing Lucien did not say out loud, did not write, did not transmit, did not put into any channel that could be traced, was the only thought that had been underneath all of the calls and the calculations and the quiet methodical movement of the last several hours. He had built a network once that moved things in the dark. Tonight he was using everything he had learned from building it, and everything he had learned from destroying it, to move 12 children out of the dark. That was not a redemption story. He did not think of it that way. It was simply the most accurate use of what he knew. Chapter 4: What Safe Feels Like. The arrests happened on a Thursday. Not at the facility. Not with sirens. The first was a man named Carlton Briggs, Chief Operating Officer of Brightbridge Youth Services. Taken from the lobby of his own building at 7:42 in the morning by two federal agents who had been waiting since 6:15. No cameras. No press. He walked out between them carrying his briefcase because no one had told him to put it down, and he did not realize until he was inside the car that the briefcase was not going to be relevant to where the morning went. The second was a woman named Phyllis Moorhead, Director of Intake Operations for the same company. Taken from her home in Bellevue at 8:05. Her neighbor later told someone that she had assumed it was a medical situation because of how quiet it was. Quiet. That word kept coming up. By noon on Thursday, 6 people had been taken into federal custody without a single news crew present. The grand jury that had been sealed for 22 months delivered its findings to a federal judge at 6:15 that morning, 2 hours before the first arrest, and the judge signed every warrant in the stack. By 3 in the afternoon, the sealed case had been partially unsealed. Specifically, the financial records connecting the operation to Senator Aldridge Beaumont's consulting arrangement. Those records did not come from the federal investigation alone. They had been supplemented by a source whose name did not appear in any court filing. The journalist was Zora Callahan Price. Her story went live at 4:17 that afternoon. By midnight, 11 million people had read it. Not because of the financial details alone, though those were substantial. Because of the children. Not their names. Not their faces. Their presence, the fact of them, the scale of them, the number of children who had moved through the parallel registry in 36 months. That number. The one Lucien had seen on his phone that Tuesday evening and had not been able to stop thinking about since. Zora printed it. Just the number. In plain sentences. Without performance. And the country read it and felt something that people only feel when a truth they had suspected but never fully confirmed finally arrives in a place they cannot push away from. Lucien watched the coverage from the living room of his actual apartment. The one with his name on the deed, the good windows, the bookshelves he had been building out for 12 years. Sitting on a couch considerably more comfortable than the one in Darius's spare room above the bookshop. Cale sat beside him. Eating cereal. Not the bowl and table kind of eating. The kind where the bowl was balanced on one knee and the spoon was managed with the focused efficiency of someone who had other things to pay attention to. He was watching the coverage with the same careful, reading-the-room attention he applied to everything. He did not understand all of what he was watching. He was 10. The financial architecture of a federal prosecution was not something a 10-year-old could fully track. But he understood certain things. He understood when the reporter on screen said the word Brightbridge. He watched the building's exterior appear on the television. A camera shot from street level, the 2-story beige structure with the fenced property, the kind of place designed to look so ordinary that no one would look at it twice. He went very still when that image appeared. Then, quietly, without writing anything, without looking at Lucien, he nodded. Once. Small. The way a person nods when something that has been held in them for a long time finally has a place to land. Lucien watched that nod from his peripheral vision and said nothing. The 11 children who had been inside the facility were not shown on the coverage. Would not be shown. The federal process had moved them to emergency placements before Thursday's arrests. Moved them carefully, with specific oversight, through a process that Lucien's contact in Washington had spent 2 days engineering to ensure no child was cycled back into any part of the system that had any connection to Brightbridge. 11 had been reached in time. The 12th, a girl named Brianna, 7 years old, had been transferred the night before Lucien's team confirmed the facility's location. Where she had gone and by whom remained the primary active thread in Demarion Osei's investigation. Lucien knew that. He was being kept informed through channels that would not appear in any discoverable record. He did not tell Cale about Brianna. Not tonight. The coverage shifted. A legal analyst appeared. Then a Senator Lucien did not recognize making a statement he could predict without turning up the volume. He turned the volume up anyway. He had learned years ago that you did not skip the parts where people who had been protected started being held responsible. Not because watching it changed anything in the moment, because bearing witness to it was its own kind of discipline, a reminder of what the work had been for. Cale finished his cereal. He reached for the notebook. It was on the cushion beside him, always within arm's reach, and held it in his lap without opening it. Lucien looked at him. He wrote on the back of a receipt from his jacket pocket. He had not lost the habit of writing with Cale rather than speaking at him, even here, even weeks into this. It had always felt like the right thing, like meeting someone in the language they used rather than the one that was easier for you. He wrote, "How are you doing?" Cale read it. He thought for longer than a simple question usually required. Then he wrote, "Different. Not bad different. Just different." He looked at the television. Then back at the notebook. Then he wrote something else, and this time the pen moved faster, like the thought had been waiting. Before, when I thought about being safe, I couldn't picture it. It was just a word, like saying warm when you have only ever been cold. You know what it means, but you can't feel it. He paused, then added, "Now I can picture it. It looks like this." Lucien read that. Read it again. He looked at the television, at the coverage that would run for weeks, at the senator's face appearing in a clip from earlier in the day, the expression of someone who had believed he was protected and was revising that assessment in real time. Then he looked at the boy beside him. Cale had pulled one knee up onto the couch, the dark blue blanket around his shoulders. His own blanket now, bought specifically for him, the one he had picked from a shelf in a store and put back twice before Lucien simply placed it in the cart without making it a moment. He looked like a child watching television on a Thursday night. That sentence was worth pausing on. He looked like a child watching television on a Thursday night. Not a child inside a system that had assigned him a number instead of a name. Not a child in shoes worn down unevenly from months of walking ready to run. Not a child whose natural omega scent had been chemically suppressed to make him easier to transport through a pipeline built by people who had decided certain lives were inventory. Just a child, on a couch, watching television. He looked exactly like what he had always deserved to be allowed to be. The weeks between that Tuesday in the café and this Thursday evening had not been smooth. Lucien had not expected them to be. Cale woke from nightmares with a frequency that did not surprise anyone who understood what his nervous system had been running on for 3 years. He startled at sudden sounds. He was particular about doors. Whether they were locked, where the nearest one was. He ate as though meals might disappear without warning. These were not things that one safe apartment and one trustworthy alpha fixed in a week. They were things that healed over time, with consistency. With the repeated experience of waking up and finding the room was still safe and the person who said they would be there was still there. There were hard days inside the good ones. A Tuesday morning, 2 weeks in, when Cale had woken from a nightmare so vivid, he had not been fully convinced for several minutes that he was not still inside it. Lucien had sat on the floor beside the couch, not touching, not pressing, and had just been visible, present. A point of reference in the room that the nightmare could not explain away. After about 10 minutes, Cale had written, "You're still here," and Lucien had written back, "I'm still here," and that had been enough. A Friday afternoon when a package arrived and the knock on the door had sent Cale to the far corner of the room before either of them fully processed what had happened. Lucien had answered the door, signed for the delivery, and set it on the table. Then he had sat down and waited. Cale had come back to the room after about 4 minutes. He had not written anything. He had just sat down and picked up his pen and started writing in the notebook the way he did when he was processing something he could not yet say. That was how most of the hard things moved. Not through talking. Through the notebook. Through the accumulated record of small exchanges that Cale had been building since that first napkin in the café. Lucien had kept every napkin. He had not told Cale that. But he had kept them in a drawer in the kitchen, flattened and stacked, the handwriting on some of them barely legible from the fold lines. He had been there, every morning. He had not made it dramatic. He had not made it a project. He had made breakfast. He had answered notebook questions honestly, especially the complicated ones. He had arranged for a therapist through a private practice that owed him a confidentiality level that would hold through any scrutiny. He had enrolled Cale in a remote academic program without requiring institutional paperwork that could have connected Cale's location to any searchable database during the weeks the legal situation was still resolving. He had been present. That was the word his therapist contact had used when they spoke about it. Not heroic. Not strategic. Present. It was, she had told him, the primary variable. The specific thing that made the difference between a child who eventually healed and one who carried the weight of not healing for decades. Not the quality of the resources. Not the intensity of the intervention. Whether someone was simply there, reliably, without requiring the child to perform gratitude for it. Lucien had not found this difficult. That surprised him more than anything else in the past 3 months. He had believed for years that he was not built for this kind of proximity. That the life he had lived, the version before the legitimate empire, and in many ways the version after it, had calibrated him out of it. That he had exchanged the capacity for warmth for the capacity for strategy, and the exchange was permanent. Cale had not asked him to be warm. He had just been there, and Lucien had just been there back. And somewhere in the accumulated ordinariness of that, the mornings, the meals, the television on Thursday evenings, the notebook answers, the blue blanket on the shelf, something had shifted. Not in Cale only. In both of them. Lucien had started leaving the corner table at the café and choosing the window seat instead. He had noticed it 2 weeks ago and had not said anything to anyone about it. He did not need to see the door as much. That was the truest measure of anything. The coverage shifted again. A new segment. A photograph of a document. One of the financial records from the parallel registry, redacted but recognizable in its structure. Lucien reached for the remote and lowered the volume slightly. He looked at Cale. Cale had fallen asleep. Not the careful, watchful near-sleep of those first days above the bookshop. Not the sleep that kept one hand on the notebook and one ear on the door. Just sleep. The specific depth of it visible in the complete absence of the managed stillness he usually carried. His head had dropped slightly to one side. The blanket was still around his shoulders. The notebook was in his lap, closed. His face was a child's face. Nothing performing. Nothing protecting. Nothing braced for what came next. Just a face at rest. Lucien sat with that for a while. A long while. He was not the kind of man who spent time examining his own interior landscape with any regularity. It had never seemed useful. The landscape of his previous life had required a specific kind of not looking inward that had calcified over time into something that simply looked like composure from the outside but was, more accurately, avoidance wearing a professional expression. He was aware of that. He was also aware that the last 3 months had quietly begun to erode it. Not through dramatic confrontation, not through any single conversation or revelation. Through the specific accumulation of small things that did not ask anything of him except to be present for them. Breakfast, notebook, blanket, another morning. He turned the television down further but did not turn it off. The light from it moved slowly across the room. Outside the windows, Seattle was doing what it did in early evening. Dimming gradually, the sky shifting through layers of gray toward the specific blue-dark that came before full night. The water somewhere beyond the buildings held a last strip of pale light before it let it go. He thought about Demarion Osei. He had not spoken to him directly. Would not, for a while. The investigation required distance, and Lucien understood the architecture of that need better than most. But the contact in Washington had passed along a single line from him. 2 words. Thank you. For 22 months of embedded work inside a system that could have ended him in multiple ways. Culminating in a sealed grand jury, 6 federal arrests, and a story 11 million people had read by midnight. Lucien had read that message and sat with it for a long time. Because it was aimed at him. At the quiet movement of money and information and legal pressure through channels that had left no visible trace. At the thing Lucien had done in the space between receiving a notebook on a Tuesday morning and Thursday morning's first arrest. He thought about Demarion's 22 months. He thought about what 22 months inside a system like that actually required. Not just professional skill, not just patience. The specific kind of sustained conviction that kept a person making the right choices when no one was watching them make it, when the wrong choices would have been easier and safer, when the thing they were working toward was so far from visible that faith in it was the only thing sustaining the work. Demarion Osei had done that for 22 months, and had trusted a 10-year-old child to be the bridge between what he had built and the moment it could become something that changed anything. That was not a small thing. Lucien sat with that. Then he thought about where the real source of all of it began. Not with Demarion's first embedded day at Brightbridge. Not with Lucien's decision to dismantle the original network. Not with the café. Not even with the notebook. With a child who, at some point in the last 3 years, had decided that the world outside the facility contained at least one person worth trusting enough to run toward. That specific decision, that specific hope, preserved somehow through 3 years of a system designed to eliminate exactly that kind of hope. Can I sit with you? 5 words on a single page. 3 months ago on a Tuesday morning. The whole thing had started there, with the smallest possible request. He looked at Kale sleeping. He thought about what came next. The legal process was long. It always was. The senator situation was still moving through the specific slow grind of consequences that landed on people with significant resources and political connections. Slower than justice preferred, faster than they expected. Brianna was still the open thread that Osei's team had made the primary active priority, and Lucien was receiving updates through the Washington contact that suggested they were close. Close was not the same as done. He sat with that. There would be depositions, motions, legal arguments about what constituted admissible documentation. There would be people who spent significant money trying to reduce what had happened to a regulatory matter rather than a criminal one. There would be moments, months from now, when the outcome felt uncertain in ways that required a specific kind of steadiness to sit through. Lucien had that steadiness. He had built it over years of understanding that the machinery of consequence was not theatrical. It did not arrive on schedule with satisfying finality. It moved in its own time, and the only option was patience, the particular patience of someone who trusted the evidence more than the timeline. He also had something he had not had 3 months ago. A reason to be in rooms that were not boardrooms. A reason for the coffee to actually get finished before it went cold. A dark blue blanket on a couch. A notebook full of handwriting that moved between 2 people in the language they had invented together. And the specific, quiet knowledge that comes from being the person someone chose when they needed to choose someone, and not having looked away from it. That last part was the most important. He had not looked away. He had not managed it from a distance. Had not arranged the pieces and then stepped back to observe the outcome from a safe remove. He had sat down in the chair across from a trembling child and written "You're safe here" on a napkin and meant it and been present enough for the meaning to hold. That was not a small thing. Lucien was only beginning to understand how not small it was. He reached over carefully and adjusted the blanket where it had slipped from Kale's shoulder. The boy did not wake. The television murmured on low. Outside, the last of the evening light disappeared behind the waterline and the city became its nighttime self. Lit from below, gray above, full of people who did not know that 3 months ago a child had crossed it alone and trusted the outcome. Lucien picked up the notebook from Kale's lap. He turned to a clean page near the back. He wrote 1 sentence in the same pen Kale used. He closed the notebook and set it back carefully. He leaned back in his seat, looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he did not feel like he was waiting for something. The thing that had always lived at the edge of every room he occupied, the low awareness of exits, the background monitoring of threat, was quiet tonight. Not gone. That kind of relearning takes longer than 3 months, and Lucien knew it. But quiet. Kale woke up an hour later. He rubbed his eyes. His gaze moved automatically, left, right, window, door, then stopped when it reached Lucien. He looked down at the notebook in his lap. He picked it up, opened it, found the clean page near the back. He read the sentence Lucien had written. He read it once, twice, the third time. Then he looked at Lucien across the room. Lucien nodded once. There was a long moment. Not awkward, not heavy, just full. The kind of moment that does not need to be moved through quickly because it is not uncomfortable. It is the opposite of uncomfortable. It is the kind of moment that a person who has spent a long time in the cold stands still inside because the warmth of it is real and they have learned not to rush the real things. Kale held the notebook for a long moment. Then he set it down on the cushion beside him. He reached for the remote on the table. He turned the television back up to the volume that was comfortable for both of them. And he leaned back against the couch cushion. Not at the edge of it. Not with his weight forward and his feet ready. All the way back. The way a person sits when they are not planning their next move. When they are just sitting. Outside, rain began again. Soft. Consistent. The particular kind that does not demand anything. It just arrives. And stays. And the sentence Lucien had written in the back of the notebook was not long. It said, "You can stay." Sometimes the smallest request carries the greatest courage. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply make space at the table. If this story stayed with you, if Kale's courage, and what one act of trust can set in motion, moved something in you, leave a comment and share what you felt. This space is for that. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story on this channel. Every story here is built around moments that change everything, and the people who show up inside them. The next one is coming, and it carries the same weight. You will not want to miss it.